So one benefit I have being here in Philadelphia to do this presentation that you all don't have is being with the art museum, which you can probably hopefully see. So I want to take you all on the rocky run along with me, okay? Well, there's Philadelphia. There's the museum. Okay, now I'm going to go up in the museum and I'll see you on the inside. So what I want to try to do is follow the story of Christendom through art, to see maybe if there's some insights that Newbigin can help apply to missionally engaging the world and how that's changed over time and what faith looks like when it's in particular cultures at particular times. So we're first going to go over here into the medieval art section to look at some of the earliest Christian art that's here in the museum, after which we will then go to moving along through the Renaissance and hopefully ultimately end up at modern art to see what mission might look like today. So across here, along this whole top section, you'll see all these tapestries around. All of these mark the life of Emperor Constantine. So these massive tapestries here that, I'll just turn you around, that mark the life and conquest of Constantine himself, to show how highly he was esteemed in the earlier medieval time. So this right here is the tapestry depicting his conversion. You can see that cross in the top left corner, coming and speaking to him, declaring how he is to be the emperor. Now the interesting thing about this is that even though Constantine lived in the late 3rd century, in the late 200s, these tapestries were all commissioned in the mid 1600s by a French king after being given these as a gift by a Catholic cardinal. And so, in less than 100 years after Calvin wrote the Institutes and the Reformation was sweeping Europe, these Europeans were commissioning works celebrating the life of the original leader who brought together Christendom into existence, bringing the church and state into one. Now we're going into the proper medieval art section. Some of my most favorite pieces in this museum. First off, interestingly, this massive piece would have gone on top of the altar of a church in the Netherlands. So this is a piece of art from the region of our great Reformation tradition. And it's Christ flanked by 2 angels and Mary and St. John, along with the skull of death to show Christ conquering over death. Something I want to point out, if you look at Christ right there, and you look at this piece, what ethnicity do you think is represented by those sculptures of Jesus? They certainly look more European than Jewish to me. And we start seeing more and more how in Christendom the cultural attributes of the surrounding culture gets joined together with that of the church and of theology and of faith. Now this next room we're going to look at, or the next three rooms are interesting because this is right before the Reformation started. And yet the first room is 14th century Netherlands Dutch painting. The next room is 15th century German painting. And then the next room is 15th century Dutch painting again. And again, we want to notice the unique European, distinctly European style of the characters and figures in the screen, in the pieces, and how that represents what they thought theologically at the time. Look at some of the motifs, what they're wearing, the themes of rulership and authority, and the distinctive styles at play. Okay. Here we are back in the main gallery. So far what we've seen, even though it did marry a lot of power and European cultural sensibilities with the theological and sacred art, you'll see all the things that we've seen so far was pre-Reformation or right before the Reformation started. Now we're going to go to the other section of European art, which is right in the midst of the Reformation time and right after. And you'll see a completely different style and feel to the art that part of me wonders is a reaction to the conflict and the ways that the Catholic Church and the Church in power doubled down on its structures of authority, more so than relenting to the critiques of the reformers. So right off the bat, you'll see some big differences in how ornate things are, and some of it is just the craftsmanship and developments in painting skill and style, but another part of it is just the elaborateness of religious art at the time. You'll see a focus more on individuals and their stories more than saints and religious figures per se. This is the time that, as Charles Taylor and even Newbigin write, is a time when the individual becomes more and more important in their own religious journey at the time. Charles Taylor calls this the time when the self becomes more buffered and exclusive humanism becomes a possibility, and more meaning and transcendence is being brought into the present life in which we live, rather than thinking that real meaning in life exists beyond this world. This world starts being filled with more and more meaning and all that's needed to have a, quote, fulfilling life. This room is an excellent example of the beginning of the focus on more individuals and not simply, like not saints or religious figures per se, and not people that kind of have that transcendent sense to them of their life stories, but everyday people. Another very interesting dynamic during this time is that even though the church has a lot of power, the stories that are captured in art and maintained are beyond just the religious. But as you saw earlier, more mythology, mythological imagery, and pastoral images as well. So you see more and more of humans and their stories and their lives being filled with more meaning and significance to culture and human transcendence and fullness, more so than the cosmic divine story. Okay, we went through pre-Reformation Europe to Europe through the Reformation to see some of the developments culturally, artistically, politically that happened at the time, and how human definition of the self and culture changed over time. Now we're going to go into the time when the modern world really came into existence. We're going to go through to European art between 1850 and 1900, and then into modern art. We'll see a big difference
where a lot of the religious themes fall away altogether, even though people were, frankly, just as religious at that time than they had at other times. A lot of the religious themes fall away or are depicted in different ways than we've seen so far.
And here we see that the religious art that is depicted, not only is there a lot less of it, but the religious art that is depicted is much more about the craft and the art itself more than it is about the sacred nature of the object. It's more about the artist's own technique more than what the object of the art is trying to communicate. For example, you see this is a sculpture by Rodin of John the Baptist's head. But you wouldn't know that. There's no sacred iconography on there to depict that it is John the Baptist. All there is that. Further, Thomas Eakins, a famous Philadelphia painter, painted this picture of the crucifixion. But again, you don't see death, the skulls at the bottom of it, to represent Christ's victory over death. It's a historical representation as much as he thought at the time, but it's filled with no theological meaning or importance. It is merely taking a common object of common knowledge and depicting it. Also, interestingly, Christ is depicted as individual, as on his own. There aren't the fullness of other characters watching the crucifixion. They're not the thieves next to him. He is an isolated figure, a symbol for us to look at and observe and follow the example of. That, in fact, that was painted around the time that critical scholarship in Germany was just starting to blow up as well. Interestingly, we go through 700 years of European history that are almost exclusively made up of religious art. And then we get to the mid-19th century, and I'm having a hard time finding art with any sort of religious imagery or topics. We have a lot of portraits, we have a lot of scenes from mythology or everyday life from the individual. You don't even have many rulers and people in power. You have everyday life, everyday scenes. Everyday life is filled with meaning and authority and transcendence, and not what lies beyond. This is one of my favorite pieces. It's Christ healing and performing miracles on the Sea of Galilee. And again, it's an act of simplicity. It's a bunch of nobodies coming to Jesus, not the disciples, not people that are exalted. And interestingly, even this piece, beautiful piece, is right here. Right next to it is this painting, which perhaps is one of the greatest depictions of the modern self that I've ever seen. We'll now step into modern art to see the context in which we live today. This is a Jackson Pollock piece called Male and Female. Is there not more perfect representation of the modern self and identity than this? This sculpture, that early 20th century, post-World War I, by a French artist. It's called Prodigal Son. It's this melding together of two figures. You don't know where one begins and the other ends. I really do think this shows the longing that people have for homecoming and what that embrace looks like. This room I find especially fascinating. It's filled with the works of Marcel Duchamp, the French artist, who was made famous by this piece. When he worked for the Museum of Modern Art in New York, he just put a urinal up on a stand and called it art. These are other pieces he did. He called these ready-mades, and it was the idea how everyday objects could be imbued with meaning depending on their context, outside of story, outside of what the objects were or symbolized or what they meant. This is the first known piece by Duchamp, painted when he was 15 years old, and it's a garden and a chapel. On the back of it, he wrote that this was the house where I was born and the church where I was baptized. 9 years later, he does these two pieces. This one is called Baptism. Oh, wow, it's really reflective. This one's called Baptism. And this one's called The Bush. And so you have this moment of anointing and blessing, it seems. Happening from an older woman to a younger woman. It's happening within a piece of nature, almost speaking to the moment where God speaks to Moses and gives him a mission. And then baptism here, a little more abstracted than this other piece. And it's not a full immersion where she's going in or coming out, and there's a moment of what looks like blessing by the older woman again. And yet once again, this is completely natural. There's no sacred imagery or symbolism. And I will end on this piece. This is a piece from 1917, right after the war to end all wars. The interesting thing about this is that this piece is entitled God. And I just think this is such good representation of the modern conception of God. He is a container, something to use to guide things, but also just piping through which we put our dreams or aspirations through. Merely a tool, a mechanistic thing. Such a big departure from what we saw in the time of Christendom, that this is what God has been reduced to. This is the definition of God in the world today. Thanks for going with me on that little trip to the museum. So what did we learn? How can this be applied to the Christian mission today? And how can the theologian and pastor Lesslie Newbigin help us with seeing how that works? And to help us understand this more, if we look at the theologian Lesslie Newbigin, just look at three things he talks about. He talks about culture, history, and plurality. First, as I said earlier, he was one of the foremost people to really stress the fact that there's no such thing as the neutral gospel. There's no core gospel that is pure and untainted, that we can take culture to culture to culture and expect it to be faithful wherever. That wherever the gospel comes, it takes on the culture around it. And we need to be aware of that when we look at the art and we see how culture has played a part in its interaction with Christianity. That we're not trying to confront the culture with some sort of neutral, pure gospel Christianity thing, but rather we're trying to see what is the gospel today in this culture. What does the gospel look like when it comes clothed in this culture itself? And then Newbigin also talks a lot about history. He has this big thing that history is a real thing. And we might think, of course it is. History, of course, is a real thing. We study it in school. We major in it. We research it. We write on it. We think in it. But he was more speaking about, philosophically, that history is an objective thing in which we inhabit. Nowadays, we more see it as something that we create as time goes on. That it's just subjective existence over time. When we went through art, we saw previously that in the medieval section, they saw the church history as world history. That wherever the church was, that is where God's movement and revelation in time was. And so by pushing the church by sword, by force and power, they were moving history along its foreordained path. But then during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, we saw that there was this turn that happened. So instead of history being subjected to the church, there was now the church being subjected to history. It was merely one institution among many.
And then Newbigin also talks a lot about plurality, cultural plurality, religious plurality, ethnic and political plurality. It talks about how the secular, we often treat the secular realm as the neutral, pure realm, the fence within which all of our religious discussions happen. God may reveal himself in other religions and the secular world through justice and beauty and mystical experiences and truth and good works. Those are meant to point beyond themselves to the truest revelation of God in Christ. So, what do all these things mean for mission, for culture and history and plurality? What do they all have to say to mission? What does Newbigin teach us? First, he declares that Jesus Christ is public truth. If Christianity is less of an abstract set of ideas about meaning and priorities and values and ethics, it is reportage of objective historical meaning. If Jesus has come into history and he has died and rose again, then that means that history is real. That God himself has engaged with history in such a way that it matters. That there is a story in which we are participating that has an end towards which we are going and working. That means that when we engage in politics and culture and structures of power, we're not trying to make them Christian. We are trying to leverage them and use them for their good, for the sake of the end towards which God made them. And our job is not to get history to that place, but to do what we know to do today and trust God to take history where he will, when he will. Newbigin also talks about how every generation and every culture has to discern what the gospel looks like in their culture for them at their time. And for us, he gave three different criteria by which to judge that. There's intellectual criteria that just goes through the logic of historical facts of Christianity. There's also a moral criteria that we see what actually leads to ethical living in our day and time. But then there's an aesthetic aspect to what the gospel should look like today. And that's where I think it's very important to engage in these artistic endeavors around us. That it sees what resonates with our culture at this time. And we see that the brokenness and the fragmentary nature of human identity and human life and the world and the collision of all these different types of thinking and believing and being in the world and not knowing by what criteria to judge them and weigh them. That this is the aesthetic nature of life today. It is trying to see truth in the brokenness, truth in the fragmentary nature of things. And so today the gospel has to be a gospel in which suffering and fragmentation and pain and disorder have a place. How the cross answers that and how the resurrection answers that. This is what Newbigin teaches us to proclaim to others. Newbigin tells us that the church is the society through which Jesus is continuing his mission in the world. He has saved people, he has chosen people, and he has brought them close to him and chosen them to be the ones that spread salvation to the rest of the world. And as we saw as we went through that story of art, we saw that we live in a world that needs this salvation, that needs this news, that needs this public truth to be proclaimed to it, to open its arms wide and invite the rest of the world in. And so I encourage you, as you engage in your own artistic pursuits, whether it's poetry or writing or song or visual arts, that you'll have an eye opened and an ear attuned to the needs of the world around us and how we as a church might be able to press forward and meet others in that need. Thank you.
postscript, I just want to say I feel like this is the Platonic form of Scott Sherman. This is a piece by Edouard Manet called Le Bon Bac, meaning the good beer. It's a man with a beer in his hand, a pipe in his hand, and a beard on his face, and a coonskin cap. So I feel like this is Scott Sherman in painting form. So, hey Scott.